In less than a fortnight, opposition forces in Syria have seized major cities including Aleppo and large swathes of territory. They faced little or no resistance from the Syrian military apart from airstrikes involving Russia. With Damascus in the opposition's sights, what's President Bashar Al Assad's strategy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to a special edition of Al Jazeera's Inside Story, coming today from the Doha Forum 2024. And we're focusing today on the dramatic developments that have taken place in Syria, transforming the political map of that country. The opposition have moved from Idlib to Aleppo to Hama, and now they are on the edge of Homs. They also control areas in the south and in the east. So what does this all mean? Does it mean the end of the Assad regime? And in these circumstances, fast-moving circumstances, is there any opportunity for talks and diplomacy? Well, we have some top experts joining us here on Syria. Charles Lister is the Director of Syria and Counterterrorism Programs at the Middle East Institute. Marie Forestier is Senior Advisor of the European Institute of Peace. And Sawsan Abou Zainedin is Chief Executive Officer of Madaniya, which is a civil society group. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to start, and it's a hard one. Predicting anything in Syria or this region is hard, but I'm going to start with the big question I'm sure the man in the street wants to know. And let me start with you, Sawsan. Are we looking at the fall of Assad?
I think we're definitely looking at a significant change in Syria. There is no turn back from this moment. Whether it is the end of the Assad regime or not, it's definitely the beginning of the change. What change we want to see is up to all of us to work on it, particularly us Syrians. This is above all a Syrian issue, a national issue, but it's also up to how we steer the regional and international dynamics so that it does not we do not end up in cementing a new geopolitical order that does not necessarily meet the aspirations of the Syrian people.
We'll get into more detail in a moment, Charles, but can Assad survive this, in your view, as things stand now?
Given the significance of what we've seen play out over the last 10 or 11 days, his days are over. It's just a question of time for me. It's a question of time and how that end comes about. I think what we're watching play out right now is a pivotal battle in Homs, and by all accounts today, it's been a very bloody battle. The Russians appear to have intervened more directly than we've seen elsewhere in the country. But given the developments we've seen in terms of opposition expansion across the south of the country, they're now roughly 35 kilometers from the outer limits of Damascus. There's no way Assad can survive this. But it is a question of, as Sawsan says, how Syrians gather together and present an alternative. But it's also ultimately a question of how the international community responds to this crisis, given the fact that there are well-established differences within and across the international community on this issue.
Marie, your quick take, your quick prediction.
As Sawsan and Charles said, that it's the beginning of a new era. It's difficult to go back to where we were 10 days ago, and it's difficult to reverse most of the gains that have been made. And now is the time for cooperation between international stakeholders, conflict parties, and also the Syrian civil society. And I think it's very important to make sure that it's a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned process. The Syrians have hung on for 12 years almost now for this time and this transition period, and that's important that they are involved and lead the movement.
Charles, a surprise attack we're all talking about, and it took everyone, certainly took all the media world by surprise, but my understanding is it was actually planned for a few weeks earlier, and it was Turkey that stopped it.
Yeah, so the offensive as it stood, first of all, was initially intended to be much more limited than anything we've seen play out. And it was initially planned for early to mid-October. At that point, as far as I'm aware at least, the Turks intervened to put a stop to it. But it nevertheless occurred several weeks later. It's important to recognize as well that in mid-October, when it was stopped, the Russian Air Force took back to the skies of northwestern Syria for the first time in 4 months and conducted a 4-day bombing campaign, so they clearly knew about the plans too. So for the stakeholders on the ground, none of this was really a surprise, or it certainly shouldn't have been. But certainly as far as the international community is concerned, honestly speaking, people weren't paying attention to the detail that was necessary to know that something like this was coming. On the other hand, no one predicted the swift collapse of the regime. Nobody, not even the groups involved. Their original intention was only to capture the western countryside of Aleppo and stop regime shelling indiscriminately targeting civilians. That was it. So they too were shocked by the speed at which regime front lines collapsed and thus continued and established the momentum we've seen play out.
Let's dig into some of that, Sawsan. I mean, Charles was saying the Russians seem to have an inkling back in October, but there seems to be a major intelligence failure by the Russians, by the Syrian regime and the Iranians this time around.
What I take from this mostly is a reminder that this, above all, is an example of how fragile the situation in Syria is. It represents the failure of a containment policy that everyone, even in the past few years, were dealing with Syria through. It's by normalizing with the Assad regime and hence by normalizing with the de facto situation. I think the big surprise was to the extent to which this regime and this situation is fragile, and which is a call to all of us really to think beyond that in the next steps.
Fragile, Marie. I mean, they just ran away, didn't they, in many cases?
Yes, what is interesting is that it illustrates the weakness of the Syrian army. Over the past year or so, the Syrian regime has tried to reform it, to professionalize it, but it's the illustration that it has been a failure. And it has been quite surprising to see withdrawal or like some soldiers fleeing away. And this is also like fueling a cycle, because this is demoralizing other soldiers in the south and also regime supporters in Damascus. So it has also an indirect effect.
Charles, I mean, let's look at Russia and Iran, because they are the ones that have saved Assad in the past. I mean, Iran, I assume, is quite weakened because of recent events, and Hezbollah particularly badly degraded. Why have we not seen more of a response, though, from Russia?
So it's a good question. I mean, everyone on the pro-regime alliance was on the front line in western Aleppo when this all started. Russian special forces took casualties, as did Hezbollah, as did the IRGC. So it wasn't that they weren't there. I think the question you asked earlier about the surprise is the right one. They should have known this was going to happen at some point, so they shouldn't have been caught on surprise. I think the main thing is that over the last several years, neither Russia nor Iran nor Hezbollah have had a significant ground presence. The Russians have an air base, they have naval vessels off the coast, but they don't have thousands of troops all over Syria. Neither do the Iranians and neither do Hezbollah. What mattered on the day was who was on the ground on the regime side defending those front lines, and it was primarily Syrian soldiers who, as Marie just said, you know, the Syrian military has fragmented, it's decayed from the inside, it's a conscript majority army, and after 14 years of horrendous suffering in Syria on all sides as ordinary human beings, it shouldn't necessarily come as a surprise that the morale within a conscript army after 14 years is not very high. And I think it's right to raise the question. You know, the international community had either given up on the Syrian crisis or had decided to normalize Assad, presuming that there was nothing else on the table to do. And in and amongst that, the Syrian people and their experience had completely been taken out of the calculations. But this is where the Syrian people and their experiences have driven all of the recent developments, and they've been clearly very dramatic.
Sawsan, tell us, you're in touch, I'm sure, with lots and lots of people in Syria right now. Give us an idea of the reactions that you're hearing. Some are very excited, celebrating. Some, I would assume, a little bit worried.
And we shouldn't underestimate that because of the uncertainty that this brings, but definitely there's an overwhelming sense of change that's driving joy and happiness and a sense of really victory that we've been waiting for long. But I think what's driving this is the potential for change and the uncertainty of what change is coming, and the fact that this needs the work and the efforts of everyone to ensure that it's a change that meets the aspiration of the Syrian people is a critical issue. With that overwhelming sense of change that brings happiness to so many, there's also underlying fears, again, because of the uncertainty of the change and who may lead on that. But it's also, so on the humanitarian side of things, we are witnessing targeting of civilians and vital civilian facilities by the regime forces. Unfortunately, the whole operations have also resulted in forced displacement of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Syrian people, particularly Kurds majorities. So some sort of demographic engineering might also result from this. But we've also seen SDF forces targeting civilians. So
that's
the casualties.
That's the Kurdish forces, just
that's
to be clear.
the majority Kurdish-led forces. So what is very fundamental in the change that we see is that it's hopefully the end of an Assad-centered rule of Syria, which means it opens the possibilities for change that we need to be in the driving seat.
But talking about being in the driving seat of the current military operation is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Now, there are lots of other groups, aren't there, Charles, but they seem to be the lead fighters in this. They were once, if you trace their lineage back, part of Al-Qaeda, and their leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, has been giving interviews, striking a much more moderate tone. You've been studying them very closely. Should we believe him?
That's the million-dollar question at this point. I mean, I would say the roots of this more pragmatic, moderate stance way predate the recent developments. They began in 2015. In fact, just as I was re-watching some videos this morning of the spokesman of this group, the then spokesman of this group, when they first rebranded their name in an attempt to show that they were different in 2016. And he was using the exact same language that Jolani is using today, 8 years later. So literally the same terminologies, the same terms to define who they supposedly are now. So first thing is to acknowledge is that that has been consistent for 8 years. This isn't some sudden change. On the other hand, whilst this group, I do think, has moderated somewhat its ideological stance, it remains politically dictatorial. Their rule in northwestern Syria has involved arbitrary arrests of critics, torture in prisons. So there's plenty of reasons to be concerned justifiably about this particular group. But from a terrorism stance, that's where I think there has been some change. And to a large extent, I think some of those changes on the ground have transformed in much greater trust with other armed factions that would previously have been fighting this group on the ground 8 years ago, and that's changed a lot.
Because, Marie, the international community are going to have to make some decisions now that they're a major player in Syria, because they still sit on that list at the United Nations of entities designated for terrorism.
They do, and that's the reason why it's also not allowed to speak to them directly for some of the international actors, which makes it even more difficult to address the situation now. So that's definitely a decision to make. As Charles was saying, I think what is important is that the group has distanced itself from a transnational jihadist agenda. So that's one of the criteria, and that's important. Then I think there are many ways to engage with this group. There are indirect ways, and there is a chance now for influencing their behavior or the way they will deal with what is coming up in Syria and if there is a transition or not.
Sawsan, people you speak to, are they concerned about this group? Because they've been making efforts. I mean, I was surprised, for example, to see that they're reaching out to religious minorities, including the Alawite community, and also in Aleppo to see billboards with QR codes on them linking to a WhatsApp message where they could be informed of the instructions coming from HTS.
Well, I think the overwhelming feeling is fear from the regime's response to this, because this is what we have seen over the past 13 years. The regime and its Russian allies, again, targeting those areas captured by the opposition groups is the biggest fears, but definitely also concerns over the how would these areas be administered. But at the same time, seeing people being freed from prison, political detainees, people whose families have thought they were killed under torture, being set out free after tens of years. Many people, thousands, tens of thousands, returning to their homes again after tens of years is again driving hope amongst people. The issue of how we as Syrians can manage to live together with all the diversity, ethnic and religious diversity, is something that we have to work on, and it's not something that is given or granted by military groups. This is where I think is the critical issue that's yet to be seen in how we manage the situation.
Marie, we've talked about Iran and Russia. What about Turkey? They clearly have some leverage on the situation. President Erdogan said the target is Damascus. We hope for this advance to continue without any issues. Are they controlling the situation or just trying to keep up with the situation?
So that's a complicated question. First of all, it's more than Turkey has leverage. Turkey is the outsider winner at the moment of what has been happening. So Turkey is not formally supporting the group leading the offensive at the moment, but they have some contacts, and it's likely that this operation couldn't have happened without at least a tacit green light from Turkey. Now, even if Turkey didn't trigger this operation, it presents opportunities for Turkey now. First of all, on its priorities, and first, the possibility to push back Kurds and Kurdish groups that are close to Turkish border, and second, the return of refugees who are living now in Turkey. There could be a perspective of return if things develop well in the areas that have been recaptured by opposition groups.
Charles, we talked earlier on about Homs being the place now. Explain to our viewers and to the audience here why Homs is really so strategically important.
Well, I mean, in terms of the most populated western spine of Syria, Homs is dead in the middle, right on the north to south M5 highway, right between Aleppo to Hama, both of which have been taken, and then south to it, Damascus and Deraa. Deraa has now been taken. Homs is also at that kind of junction point, which would, in theory, if Homs were to fall, Damascus would be cut off from the coast, where Assad and his sort of Alawite heartlands lie. So its geographic position, right in the heart of the country, right in the middle of this highway on this north to south road, but also its access west to the coast make it of enormous strategic significance. For many, Hama had been the steel wall through which the opposition for 13 years had never broken through and ever been able to contiguously link the north to the south. Now that that's broken, Homs is the last front line for the regime. As far as I'm concerned, if Homs falls, Assad is 100%, he's finished. It will just be a matter of time and how that gets there. And as I said earlier, it does look like the Russians are trying more hard than we've seen until now to make Homs a front line that doesn't get moved. But looking at the momentum all across the country, it's very hard to see how the regime forces that are in Homs will see the defense being a cause that is worthy of dying for, when really everything, the writing seems to be on the wall.
And Sawsan, I mean, Homs was, at the early part of the war, one of the places where some of the heaviest battles and worst death tolls occurred, was it not?
That's very true, and we need to factor this in, actually, the sectarian dynamics in Homs, but also the fact that Homs has witnessed some of the worst violations, the communities in Homs. I hope this is the beginning of change in there. I definitely agree with Charles that taking over Homs would change the game for the Assad, but it would also change the game for so many people who have been awaiting justice and acknowledgement for a very long time.
Marie, if Homs falls, and as Charles says, it's a break, the Assad territory is divided into two, the coast is divided from Damascus, that's a big problem for the Russians, isn't it? Because their large naval base, which has been given to them as a sovereign base for 49 years, that is on that coast at Tartus, and so is their main air base.
Exactly, and that's when Russia will have a decision to make, and what are their priorities. Do they want to continue supporting Assad, the regime, or do they narrow their priorities in Syria and focus on this strategic advantage that represents the naval base in Tartus and the aerial base in Latakia that allows Russia to project power in the region, and this is a key asset after Russia invests so much in Syria and the Syrian crisis. So I think that's really a matter of strategic choice, capacity also a little bit because Russia is constrained with the war in Ukraine. And there are also factors such as the relationship with Iran and Turkey that probably factor into this choice. But so that's a choice that is hanging right now, I think.
Charles, what's the space for diplomacy now in these very fast-moving developments? Here at the Doha Forum, where we are right now, we understand possibly very soon, possibly right now, there is a meeting taking place between the foreign ministers of Russia, Iran and Turkey. Does the diplomacy need to be much broader than that?
To be determined. That Astana format, as it's called.
That's after a place in Kazakhstan where they had numerous meetings that didn't get very far earlier on in the war.
22 meetings, I think, and this would be, I think, the 23rd. So yeah, I mean, what has been called the Astana format has for several years now really been the only format that has determined dynamics and realities on the ground in Syria. So in theory, yes, although I suspect that recent developments may also challenge that particular format. More broadly, I think the international community has to be mobilizing around the Syrian issue right now, in part because, frankly, some of the international community have got it so dreadfully wrong over the last 18 to 24 months.
And Marie, does this need to be led now by the United Nations? Because their process has got completely bogged down, but in part that is... We've spoken about the Russians and their role militarily, but the Russians have been a great asset to the Assad regime diplomatically. They've used 17 times, I think, their veto in the UN Security Council, and they've managed to slow down the diplomatic process. I covered long negotiations in Geneva when Lakhdar Brahimi was the special envoy, and one of the Western diplomats at the time called the chief Syrian negotiator Ambassador Filibuster, because all he was trying to do was stop anything going anywhere.
No, that's a good point, and this will probably, or this may change the dynamic at the Security Council and diplomatically internationally. But I would like to highlight that if the UN-led peace process has been bogged down, as you said, it's mainly because of the refusal of Assad to engage in any process and to have any sort of dialogue. So that was the main issue and not the process in itself. So the UN is best placed to conduct any type of dialogue or political negotiations, but as Sawsan said, it's very important that it is as inclusive as possible and that it takes into account also the reality on the ground and parties to the conflict and actors who are active on the ground and in control of some areas.
Sawsan, I assume there needs to be some immediate talks on the humanitarian situation, because that, I'm told, is getting pretty urgent. It was already humanitarian needs, although the world wasn't watching. We're at an all-time high with 7 out of 10 Syrians requiring humanitarian assistance. The latest figures I've seen from the UN is a further 370,000 people have been displaced from their homes in recent days.
And the first thing I think diplomacy needs to work towards is protection of civilians, protection of civilians from all kinds of violations, including the bombardment of the Assad regime and its allies, which continue until the moment to target civilians and again civilian areas and civilian facilities, but also from engineered displacement processes, forced displacement processes, and other forms of violations. So protection of civilians remains a priority. And then, in the meantime, until we get to a stage where a political process is functional and is is actually representing the interests of Syrian people themselves. We need to be very aware of how the administration of the different areas that are getting out of the control of the government will be established, and working towards an independent civic administration of these areas is a priority. So we do need to think in how we respond to the needs in these areas through this mindset, by creating a civic administration that works through the institutions, the current state institutions, and with the efforts of the current people on the ground, not through an NGO model.
Charles, I mean, there's also a difficulty if you get to a stage where the Assad regime is gone, and I know I'm jumping ahead of myself a fair bit here, and I'll give you two recent examples of the Americans. One, Afghanistan, where they left all the warlords stay in the government, and then Iraq, where everyone who was a member of the Ba'ath Party was expelled. Both turned out to be pretty disastrous.
They did. I would say there's not necessarily any easy way to deal with that challenge, particularly given that we are in year 54 of the Assad family's reign. So the extraordinary kind of bureaucratic challenge of picking that out, but also allowing bureaucrats to remain in place will be difficult. Deep family ties within the government apparatus, some not problematic, some arguably are problematic. That will be an enormous challenge, as will be the remnants of the entire intelligence apparatus, which has long been a problem. You could foresee Assad going, but much of those institutions will still remain. And as we've heard from Syrian people since day one of the revolution, that is the issue that has to be removed. I think the one thing that we can count on is that amidst 14 years of crisis, and particularly in more recent years, my assumption is the vast majority of Syrians, including within the state, who have survived and stayed within regime-held areas, do want change. It's just that fleeing the regime or turning against the regime wasn't foreseen in their personal minds as an option for so long. And so I have a feeling that if Assad was out of the way, that problem was out of the way, that we have a higher chance of the Syrian people coming together and figuring that out than maybe we might have seen in other contexts.
Sawsan, are you as optimistic? I mean, I'm thinking Saddam Hussein went and there was an appalling war. Gaddafi went, other places in the Arab Spring. Toppling is not always, and it hasn't happened yet, and maybe it won't happen, but it's not always the answer.
But I am very optimistic. I'm optimistic because of the capacity we have developed as Syrian civic actors. And again, because without addressing the root causes of the crisis in Syria, no change can come. Now that we are looking at a future where potentially the Assad regime is out of the picture, there's a lot to capitalize on thanks to the efforts of Syrian civic actors. So I am definitely optimistic. What matters is that we work towards maintaining state institutions in the process of throwing out the Assad regime.
We end on an optimistic note. Thank you very much to our panel today, Charles Lister, Marie Forestier, and Sawsan Abou Zainedin. That ends this special edition of Inside Story. Remember, we produce this program every single day of the year, and you can watch it on Al Jazeera, on television at aljazeera.com, or on YouTube. Thank you very much to our audience here at the Doha Forum 2024, and thanks to you for watching. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.